Hello, world. This is Maya. I would like to welcome you back to another podcast edition of Hello, World with Maya. And in this edition, I am going to interview a good friend of mine, Stephanie Holmes. And I have talked about her and promoted our podcast from Converge Autism Radio. And today, Stephanie is going to talk to us about women on the spectrum and girls on the spectrum because she's a real expert, and she also has a daughter on the spectrum named Sydney, who is just as cute as a button. So before I get into the interview, I have a few announcements. So on the last Sunday of the month, you can find with Haley Moss, and she is the first autistic lawyer in Florida. And she was supposed to be on our panel last month, but because of COVID-19, that opportunity got postponed until later this year. So I decided to interview people and do podcasts with them. And I decided that in addition to Stephanie Holmes and the women on the panel, Haley would be a really nice touch. So anyway, you can also find spanking brand new episodes of the podcast at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's usually just me talking. And I talk about anything from inclusion in the workplace to social justice issues. But my main objective is to raise autism awareness and autism acceptance together. And I've been up and running as a blogger since 2013. Or my hashtag or my campaign is called Taking Middle Grounds. And instead of walking in red or blue, I like to walk in purple because I'm a self-advocate and a professional. And so I believe that bringing autism awareness and autism acceptance together, you get red and blue, and that makes purple. So anyway, without further ado, I'm about to introduce Stephanie Holmes. So anyway, Stephanie Holmes has her her educational doctorate, and she has a master's, and she is a professional let me start again. Stephanie Holmes is a educational doctorate. She just graduated. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
And she is a professional counselor and a certified autism specialist. But her real credentials come from being the mother to an amazing Aspie young adult and self-advocate. Stephanie's career focus changed when her eldest daughter was diagnosed with Asperger's in 2004. She is a recent graduate with a doctorate in education with her dissertation study, Creating an Inclusive Climate for Students on the Autism Spectrum. Her book, Confessions of a Christian Counselor and How Infertility and Autism Grew My Faith, was released in the fall of 2015. Stephanie counsels, consults, and coaches ASD/NT neurodivergent couples from all over the United States and internationally, and can be contacted through counselorstephanieholmes.com. She is an interim host for Converge Autism Radio with Brook Behavioral Health. And Stephanie, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. Hello, world, and hello, Maya.
And thank you so much. And I would love to talk to you sometime about your expertise with marriage and family counseling for people on the spectrum, because I think that's so important, and that's a topic that's hardly ever reached. But today, I think the main thing we're going to do is focus on women. And I realized something during this edition of this World Autism Awareness Month or World Autism Acceptance Month. I realized that all of my interviews really focus on women on the spectrum. And even though you're not on the spectrum, you are a woman, and your daughter is a woman. So anyway, I'm about to get started, but before I do that, I have one other announcement. So again, Stephanie is part of Converge Autism Radio. And again, you can find our podcast in the in my other resources. And I share my experiences of living on the spectrum and transitioning from high school into college. And you can find that posted back in September of 2019. You can also find lots of interesting content on Converge Autism Radio. One of my favorite interviews that Stephanie did was with one of my favorite BCBAs, Dr. Jim Ball. He just has a really, really unique way of explaining himself, and he has a great sense of humor. I heard him a year and a half ago at a Future Horizons Autism Conference up in Nashville, Tennessee. And I would love to have Dr. Ball on the show because not only is he expertise about autism, he has a very unique way of relating to people on the spectrum, and he doesn't look at them like they're really broken. I mean, he's a great guy, and I think he's very passionate about what he does. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to start with the questions.
Awesome.
Just let me pull those up just a second. So could you tell us more about Converge Autism Radio while I get the questions up?
Sure. So Converge Autism Radio is part of Springbrook Behavioral Health, and they have their big conference every year. Unfortunately, it was supposed to be this spring in April, but due to COVID-19, it's been moved to the fall. But part of what Converge Summit and Springbrook Behavioral Health and Converge Autism Radio is to give broad perspectives. I like to bring on people on the spectrum because I believe in empowerment of the voice of the spectrum, and not just from professionals. So we might have professionals, educators, parents, people on the spectrum, people who work with marriages, people who work with families, people who work with children, OTs, PTs, to keep broadening our perspective of autism, to broaden education, awareness, and acceptance.
That's really good. How long have you been a co-host of Converge Autism Radio?
Well, I started out, I did some speaking for them as a track speaker, and then last year at the summit, Dr. Grandin and I were two of the main keynote speakers. Of course, most people were there to see her. I was there to see her myself. But through that, I kind of met some more people through Converge Autism Radio, and they began to interview me on their podcast as a host, as a guest. And then a host stepped down, and they were looking for someone to fill that position. And they said, you know what, you're pretty knowledgeable on various aspects of autism, so would you consider hosting? And I said, sure. And so I've got to meet and speak with a lot of great people, interviewing you and interviewing people like Dr. Atwood and Dr. Ball, and just a lot of different people from different perspectives to just kind of bring our worlds together, what we're doing in autism, kind of bring it together in one place.
Now, I know Temple has been on Converge Autism Radio before.
Yes. Now, I have not gotten to interview her. Kristen Walker, who runs Mental Health Radio, which is what Converge Autism is kind of a segment under. She has had that privilege many times because she'll usually go to the conferences and interview people right there at the conference. And so I do kind of like you, set up the Zoom and the appointments and do the weekly broadcast.
Well, I hope you get that chance because Temple is a nice person, and she is a fireball. Let's put it. She's right. A fireball, and she has a unique way of expressing herself. And Dr. T is a real comedian, and that's why I enjoy listening to her, because she not only educates you, but she gets you laughing at the same time.
And she was certainly a pioneer. Her and her mother were pioneers, kind of starting awareness about autism in females. And, you know, if you know I know you know Dr. Grandin's story, but for those who don't, you know, get the movie. But from what they went through back to fighting being institutionalized for simply being on the spectrum and everything that she went through in her life, really, I consider her a pioneer for women on the spectrum.
Yeah, she is a pioneer. And she moved to the West, you know, get the joke?
Right? She really did. She forged ahead.
She forged ahead. I mean, she's a pioneer, but she really moved to the West, and she was born in the East, in Boston. So, and yes, Temple really does work with cattle, just like the ranchers did back in the 1800s when they were moving from the East Coast into the West to settle. So, I was sort of making a joke there.
I got it. Good joke.
Thank you so much. And yes, it's funny because I've noticed something in the media, every time I turn around, I'm finding that, yes, despite The Good Doctor and the TV show Atypical, I'm noticing that the media seems to be more interested in women on the spectrum than they are in men. Have you noticed that?
I am noticing a slight shift. The first show that really had, even though it wasn't said she was a woman on the spectrum, was Bones from that show. But if you read how that show was patterned, it was patterned after a woman on the spectrum, I think in Canada. So although the show never said that. So I think we're starting to see more shows where autism or spectrum is actually the word is being said versus showing someone with traits and hoping that you make the inference as to what you're seeing on the screen.
Well, the reason why I bring that up is because even when Temple became who she is today, or started to climb up the success ladder, and people started to really want to hear what she had to talk about at her small group discussions, and listening to her talk in small auditoriums, that's a woman, and this was back in the 80s. So people have always had their eyes on women on the spectrum. Especially in this day and age, if you know what I mean.
Right.
So anyway, I'm about to ask you questions. So I understand that girls and women can mask more easily than men and boys on the spectrum. Could you tell us more about the masking?
Yeah, I think, way back when my daughter was diagnosed in 2004, the rate of diagnosis was 10-1 boys to girls, and now it's about 4-1 boys to girls. And I think masking is part of why girls were not diagnosed as easily. It tends to be, if you think about school, usually in school, someone's not really going to be identified unless they're having a behavior issue that's really disruptive to the class, or if someone's not meeting their marks on those wonderful standardized tests at the end of the school year. So in general, I mean, my daughter was certainly a person with disruptive behavior, but in general, boys to girls tend to be the more disruptive in the classroom. So that also can get someone an earlier diagnosis versus girls, because the female brain is wired still a little more towards social engagement than the male brain, can more easily kind of adapt, almost like a chameleon, to the situation. Like, what is my role and who do I need to be in here? And not or how like neurotypicals would do it. Neurotypicals might do that to be popular, to gain notoriety, to gain attention. Whereas the women on the spectrum that I work with, their masking is more to blend in. I don't want to stand out. I don't want to stand out for being too in a positive way. I don't want to stand out for being in a negative way. I just kind of want to be, and I really don't want that attention put on me. I don't want the spotlight put on me. So some of that masking is anxiety reducing, and then some of it is a form of trying to make a friend or try to figure out a social situation, especially if they're not diagnosed and they haven't had someone work with them on social skills or relational skills, or just work out their anxiety. That masking becomes kind of a coping mechanism.
So what exactly is masking?
So we think about masking as, when you're in a social situation, almost like filling a certain role. So if I am Stephanie the professional, I might be a different role at a conference versus Stephanie the mom or Stephanie that attends at my church. I'm all Stephanie, but I'm in a certain role. But masking is a little bit more about trying to adapt almost your persona and who you are, the way you're being perceived. So unfortunately, sometimes some of my clients have been misdiagnosed as borderline or histrionic or even personality, because their presentations can be so different in different places, but they're not trying to fool people. They're not trying to be manipulative. It's their way of trying to cope and fit in, putting on a mask, almost a different face of who I am, so that this group will accept me or won't bully me or will just let me be and not give me much attention. So that masking is almost a hiding of oneself. A lot of people will tell me they don't feel comfortable stemming or being their true autistic self in a lot of neurotypical circles. So the mask sometimes is a way, sadly, to hide sometimes some of their autistic features.
Well, As a woman on the spectrum, the last several years, I probably have become very comfortable with who I am, but I haven't been putting on the mask. And I've been trying to make people aware that I'm autistic because I want them to learn about autism. I mean, I want to spread awareness and acceptance, but people still have not gotten the acceptance piece. And so other people want me to mask. And this happened at this last synagogue I went through. The rabbi there expressed or expected me to stop drawing attention to myself, go pace back and forth somewhere else. You're making other people around you uncomfortable. And he was also giving me knuckle bumps and acting like I was a little kid. And he was calling things like I was a little buddy. He didn't even pay attention to who I am as a whole, but that's off topic. Thank you so much for explaining that to me.
And two, you can speak to it personally, but for people who are masking, that's extremely exhausting. And so if someone's had to go to college or go to a class and they've been socially masking all day, using like twice as much energy, trying to follow the rules, so to speak, and mask and try to be this person that you're not, it could really cause mental health issues. You know, that you get home and like spent for the rest of the day, can't do anything else because it took all the energy that a person had to do that social masking. So not only it's a coping mechanism for stress, but then it also really depletes that person after trying to mask for long periods of time.
So I lived with two roommates that were 6 and 8 years older than I was before I moved here to Atlanta. And it was during that year that I had tried to mask and I tried to pose as normal. I also kept it to myself that I didn't have an autism diagnosis, but my colleagues, or not my colleagues, but my roommates thought there was something off about me and I just wasn't picking up on things. So it didn't really work out and I struggled to fit in socially and just fit into the niche with my roommates. And they were both eldest women or neurotypical women as well.
And because even though many of my clients and even my daughter would say the same thing, you know, well, I'm just going to pretend or I'm going to go into the world. I'm not going to introduce myself as autistic and then maybe they won't know. But, you know, part of not all neurotypicals, but many neurotypicals, especially if they have high emotional intelligence or, you know, high kind of people skills, they're going to feel that kind of offness or difference. And so I always like to say, tell them the truth, tell it what it is. Don't let them come up with the label. Don't let them say odd, weird, eccentric, whatever. Tell them the real reason, tell them the real label and let them know this, you know, what it is versus sometimes the label's much worse when someone's coming up with their own opinion of why they feel someone's a little different. I just like for people to know the truth and know the real reason so we can not only spread awareness, but acceptance. I like to call April Autism Action Month because I feel like we should be aware by now. We should be accepting and making action points to be more accepting.
I call it Taking Middle Grounds Month without the word autism. Now, for me, I've tried to tell people that I'm autistic, and every time I do, I always get the stereotyped responses like, oh my goodness, do you have a social worker? Who's helping you with your groceries? Are you on Social Security? Are you okay? And then people start talking to me like I'm 5 once they find out I'm autistic. And that's more like awareness, not acceptance. So anyway, so what percentages of women are getting a later diagnosis?
So I was trying to look up that percentage for you before we got online, and I can't tell you an exact percentage, but I can tell you with my clientele, most of the women that I work with, they have gotten their diagnosis after the age of 30. And the reason that is because they weren't disruptive in school. Maybe their grades were okay. They were misdiagnosed with something else first, you know, so maybe sometime in their teens or young adults, they were feeling very anxious and maybe social anxiety or some kind of phobia, or maybe they had an eating disorder that really wasn't a true eating disorder. It was more about calories or numbers or texture of food. And so it took maybe someone in their family getting diagnosed, or it took maybe losing a job, or kind of this total exhaustion from the masking and why is this so much more difficult for me? And so somewhere in that 30 to 40 range is where a lot of my clients end up getting that diagnosis, because motherhood or being married is like, this is stressful and this is hard, but it shouldn't be this hard. And so, like I said, a lot of clinicians don't really understand what they're looking for, because there's not really a standardized test for, like with young children, there's a lot more standardized things, a lot of inventories that you can use to diagnose a child, and you have a mother or a parent or other people kind of giving that information. And so part of the issue with diagnosing someone on the spectrum is sometimes there isn't a lot of that self-awareness there. And so it's really important to have someone else's input sometimes, because maybe the person, that's what they're seeking. They're trying to find out, I feel different. Why am I having this anxiety? But they don't have someone kind of helping them put the boundaries on that. Or, you were kind of always like that way as a child. You've been anxious since you were 5, not since you were 15. And so getting that diagnosed later in life, people kind of respond to it differently. Like, this makes a lot of sense. Oh my goodness. I wish I would have known this when I was younger. And then some people get really upset because of the stigma of autism, and they almost grieve that diagnosis, like, oh no, what's wrong with my life? I'm never going to amount to anything, because that's what teachers said, or that's what people in their life said. So there's a high percentage of women on the spectrum getting diagnosed later in life, and I would like to see that change, because the more skills and those interventions that anyone can get, no matter what your diagnosis or label is, the more we want to create confidence and kind of competence in who I am, and not this, stigmatized label over people. But I always say too, when I'm working with someone, my goal is never to quote neurotypicalize someone. That's not the goal. The goal is, what are the skill deficits or that you feel that you're struggling with, and let's make an outcome based on what you want to learn and what you want to work towards, not what I think you need to be working on, not what society thinks you need to be working on. What's your goal? Where do you want to go? And how do we get there?
So thank you so much. That was a really great answer. What are the statistics and diagnosis in women versus men?
I think right now we're still seeing about 4 to 1. Dr. Atwood, Dr. Grandin tend to quote the 4 to 1, but most professionals still think that number, that women are still being missed, because people don't know what they're looking for necessarily in women. If we go back to how the autism diagnosis came about, and you go back to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, all of the information was really normed on boys. Research was done on boys. All the labels and things really encompassed males on the spectrum and not females on the spectrum. So while all the symptoms match when you go through the DSM-4 and DSM-5, there's just slight different nuances on how some of those things might be displayed among the genders. And so you really need to know what you're looking for, because maybe with boys, maybe their special interest is modes of transportation, and that's quote obvious and that's stereotypical, but maybe a girl's in historical fiction or really loves horses or animals and cats. And so that seems, quote, normal. But the degree to which that person really loves horses or historical fiction and has, their own library of horses and knows everything that someone else her age doesn't know, that's the part. It's almost like if you're a girl, it's socially acceptable. Oh, she's just a high achiever. Oh, she's just got a great vocabulary. Whereas if a boy is doing that, there's something like, oh, what's going on here? But it's almost praised for young girls or women who are like high achieving and, collecting things. It somehow doesn't, it's not seen the same from the clinical world. So we're still getting a higher diagnosis of men versus women, but I think clinicians just aren't always sure, educators aren't sure what they're looking for in women and girls.
Now, I am obsessed with cats, and I've got to tell you, people always recognize me as highly intelligent, But in terms of cats, I was never really interested in all the facts about cats until later on when I started getting into college and stuff, and just started my education, just taking some academic classes with things like cats' body language and facial expressions. Now, I have to tell you, when I went to or first started going to Java Cats here in Atlanta, which is a cats cafe, I would go there and try to start connecting with people. And I would start educating them about cat behaviors. And there were a couple of young millennials or young adults that were in there, and they were kind of snotty. Do you work here? So that's the kind of stereotype that I got. But when I was younger, people preferred to me as the girl that had limited interests. And there are people that are still stuck on that idea. And unfortunately, I have people in my family who, whenever they've tried to contact me, it's like they don't talk to me like you and I are talking now. What they do is they'll say, "How are you doing? We got together with your grandma. Look at these cats." And I don't want to hear about that. It's like, hello, I know how to relate. So people still stereotype me as the girl with limited interest. Or when I was at that synagogue, again, they would talk down to me, and they would change the subject around me because they assumed that I understood limited interests. And no, that's not true at all.
Right, and I think something that both of you and I are saying is we would like educators and professionals and people working with individuals on the spectrum. It's always great to presume competence. Start there. Start with presuming competence and speaking to the person at their age level, and then as you get more information, if that person maybe isn't at their age level, or you need to adapt or shift based on where that person is, you make that adjustment. But starting with competence and assuming this person does understand you and that you can relate to that person, I think that's the starting point, not starting with a stereotype and go, oh, this person is competent. I need to treat them like a competent person. Let's just start at presuming competence. And if there are other issues that come up as you learn and connect with that person, then adapt to where that person may be. But I like to do the reverse. Start with presuming competence.
Now, I understand that girls often fall victim to higher rates of date rape in high school out of loneliness. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. In my dissertation research, one of the young ladies that volunteered as a participant told a story, which is in the research. Actually, that's how she got her diagnosis. She was one of these students who was exceptional. She was in dual enrollment and IB and AP and all of those classes, so no one assumed she would have had any, quote, issue or diagnosis or label. But she was someone who was a bit of a loner and didn't really have a lot of social groups, but she very much wanted to be social, and she very much wanted to relate to people. And I call certain people are kind of predators or sharks. And they can kind of sense vulnerable people. They can sense people that could be easily taken advantage of and naive. And this young woman shares a story that, through her schooling, kind of an older male started kind of showing her attention, and she thought they were boyfriend, girlfriend, and it ended up in an assault situation. And it was through that situation she actually got her Asperger diagnosis, because she was unaware of what he was doing, unaware of how he perceived the relationship, because she perceived the relationship as boyfriend, girlfriend, and he saw it as hit and run, to score and to leave. And that kind of naivety and that lack of really picking up on the social clues, other people were trying to warn her that maybe this isn't a safe person. And so sometimes a lot of my teenagers and young adults in college, they've had the experience of being left out, being bullied, being teased, just being excluded from groups, or I was listening to one of your podcasts on tokenism. You know, we have this token person in our math club. We like having her here or him here because he's really good with math and he's our neurodiverse person on our group. So they've experienced that. And so they get into a group and maybe try to join a sorority or fraternity or join something that says, I have social value, I want to be part of something. And then that lack of social skills, lack of being able to read people's intentions, sometimes puts especially women in a vulnerable place. Physical assault, sexual assault, and sadly sometimes in relationships where there's domestic violence.
Yeah. Now, I have to tell you this, sorry, I can't communicate today, but I have to tell you this experience. So what this young woman went through reminds me somewhat of what happened in my old job. And I've talked about this job a million times, and I am actually going to talk about this in my presentation in the women's panel in the fall, which is part of the Powerhouse Strong series, and it's the Power Up. And as I told you, I am going through the list of women on the panel, including Haley Moss and then Jennifer Reese-Polson. And we're going to do a talk about inclusion in the workplace, autistic women and neurodiversity. And that's why you heard Kayla, and that's why you also heard from Ashley. And my topic is going to be about sexual harassment in the workplace. And at this old job, I dealt with sexual harassment, and the owner's brother, he's dead now, but when he was alive, he would approach girls that were vulnerable, and he would also play around and just flirt with women. Well, this was a man in his late 40s, early 50s. He would come up to me and call me things like his number one secret girlfriend, and he would give me hugs and hold my hand, and we'd walk around, just kind of snuggle around at work. And I had no idea what it was. I was incredibly naive to the idea. I thought that I had an actual friend in the warehouse, and he would do things like give me massages, but he would also talk about dirty things. Like he would talk about things that were sexual and talk about things that he wanted to do with me in the warehouse, and just walk around the warehouse and stand behind me and hold up my my cleavage, just walking around the warehouse, and also talk about how he wanted me to touch his private part. And so for a while it was funny, and I thought it was cute, and perhaps I too was a little lonely, and I was also vulnerable. And perhaps this person, perhaps this person was a shark or a predator. Actually, he was a predator, because he was nice to my face, but what he was really doing was he was taking advantage of me and sexually harassing me, and I didn't realize it. So anyway, I looked online, and or actually I take it back. I ended up becoming smart enough through reading content during the first 2 years of my education at Georgia Perimeter College. This was a couple of years before I transferred my credits to GSU, which is now where I go to school and where I work. And, one book I read was a health class. It was a health subject. And in this subject, they talked about sexual harassment. And that's when I realized I had to put my foot down. Now, by then, I had already had my second diagnosis as somebody on the spectrum, but I started to put my foot down to his behavior.
Absolutely. And sometimes where the autism might get caught in there is if a person really loves their job and they don't want to lose their job. So because it's part of their routine, like this is the job that I wanted to work at this company and I wanted to work in this position, kind of getting stuck in that routine. It's like, oh, but if I tell on this person, I might lose my job. And so again, becoming vulnerable because I don't want to lose my job and I don't want to lose my routine and I don't want to leave, the great parts of this job. Sometimes, and this is women in a lot of industries, enduring things they shouldn't have to because they're afraid of losing this job. And then especially if you put that kind of autism piece in of, this is my routine and this is what I want to do, and it's not fair that I should have to lose my job by, telling on this person. Sometimes that comes into play and adds to that vulnerability, because then that predator person kind of knows, oh, she loves this job. There's nothing she's going to do to mess up this job. And it also makes them kind of feel more emboldened and more empowered. Kind of adds to that.
Now, this job was different though. This was a work program. Remember I told you about it, or you heard Kayla and I talking about it being a work program?
Right. Yeah.
Well, it was a very toxic work environment, and I was sent there through a sheltered workshop. Not going to give the name out, not going to say who it was, because this is public. But I was sent to this work program, and they placed me into this warehouse, and they really didn't do that much with us. They just put us in a room and had us scan computer parts. And if we ran out of those, we would either throw computer parts into recycle bins all day, or they would have us clean the warehouse or clean around the office. And they really didn't do that much with us. But the people that worked at that company were very predatory. And the boss's brother was one of them. And then there was another one that was sort of a family friend, and he had other disabilities, and he was also part of the program. But I do believe in some sense that they were using him as the token just to show off, because they were, because they knew him, and he also had some good managerial skills. But he was also a predator, and he took advantage of a woman there that had different disabilities, and she lived in a group home and was under a guardianship. And she took that relationship seriously and wanted to get married. Well, after they broke up, she was very hurt about it. And nobody understood why she got angry. Instead of understanding that there was a conflict between them and that she was very hurt, and not really understanding why she kept trying to win him back and losing her temper and losing it more and more and picking on him more and more. Instead of really understanding where she was coming from, they demonized her. And they said sexist things about her, like she's turning psycho, like she's dangerous. Is that common?
Yeah. So for the person who's the predator or the shark, as I call them, people who are narcissistic, they have advanced theory of mind. So, right, we talk about theory of mind. Sometimes skill deficit for persons on the autism spectrum. Well, there are some people with really advanced theory of mind. And with that, they don't always use their power for good. They use that to get to know somebody. They get to how to push that person's buttons. Then how to use social networks and, talk about this person behind this person's back. Use division so that this person now won't trust this person, but you're talking bad about both people. And then you kind of circle the wagons, and then the person that you're maybe doing something to that's inappropriate, you want everybody else to not think that this person's credible. So the predator person then starts to cast that bad light using that advanced theory of mind for evil purposes, to get those, and they know what the people in their networks, wouldn't like to hear about that person. So they bring up all this negative thing. And so now if the person wants to say something or wants to defend themselves, or simply wants to do what any person would want to do in an unsafe situation, now that's the person who's the problem. We're going to all point our finger and say that's the issue over there, because then it's the spotlight off the person who's actually the one causing the problem and cast on the victim. And so that's part sometimes of politics that goes on in the workplace, but especially those who are kind of narcissistic or bully or have that manipulative kind of feature. I just call them predators and sharks, because I think they're on the lookout for vulnerable people. And then persons on the spectrum tend to be a vulnerable category. And sometimes those things become a very dangerous combination.
Now, the sort of similar situation happened to me. The only difference was I was not afraid to speak up for myself when I found out I was being sexually harassed. And unfortunately, the job coaches didn't do anything. And then the boss who ran the company, she is extremely narcissistic. And she's one of those people that will protect her family no matter what they do, whether they're good or bad. And instead of standing up for me, she chose to put the blame on me. And she told me that I was she said I was overreacting. And she told me that he was just playing around. It's like, he didn't rape you, did he? No. And so she said, if you don't like what he's doing, then stay out of his office. She was very nasty about it. And like you were talking about, there were several people at that company, including the guy who sexually harassed me, he, and then another girl who pretended, or a woman who posed as my friend. And she turned out to be a pathological liar, just lies all the time. And she has some other issues of her own. She was also a predator, and she latched herself onto me like she was my friend. And then we did things together, but then she just kept pulling things on me like little stunts. And then she would make me step on eggshells around her. So that relationship was unpredictable. And then one day another girl got hired, and then suddenly she just started ignoring me, and she and a few of the other coworkers would kind of hang out together in a room, and then I'd go in and try to hang out. They'd get up and walk out of the room if I'd walk in. Well, I found out that she was talking about me behind my back, and they tried to lie and pull the wool over the eyes of the new coworker. They tried to get her to believe that I was the liar, and they tried to get her to believe that I was messed up. And they just started saying all kinds of nasty things about me behind my back. It was horrible. And, you know, I wanted out of that job so bad. I mean, I liked it at first because it wasn't the food industry, but I didn't like the way people treated me. And then when I became more engrossed in my education, I wanted to work in an environment like a university setting, where other people would be more accepting. And they're very accepting at Georgia State, the Center for Leadership and Disability. And I like the things that they're doing. At this old company, it just wasn't supportive. So anyway.
It's about supplying the supports and resources that the person needs. And I always like to ask my female clients, there are two books I really like. I like Tending to be Normal and Safety Skills for Asperger Women. Both of those are by Dr. Leanne Holliday-Willie. Especially in the safety skills for Asperger women, it talks about dating, it talks about kind of taking care of your body, it talks about people who are kind of those sharky predator people, how to look out for them and how to identify the red flags of dangerous situations in these relationships. And I'm pretty sure she's a person on the spectrum as well, so she's talking from her personal experience and her educational experience. So that's a book I'd like to recommend out there for women on the spectrum, is Safety Skills for Asperger Women by Dr. Willie.
Yes. When I did my first panel in 2009, there was the Monarch, remember the Monarch School that was put on by the Emory Autism Center? Yes. Hello? Can I hear you?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, you're breaking up there for a second. But, the Monarch School was put on by, Sheila Wagner, right?
Right.
Yeah. I did not know she had written some books through Future Horizons. And I'm pretty well affiliated with FH as well. Only I blog for them right now. And there are some other projects I want to do with them. But anyway, when Sheila or Dr. Wagner was running the Monarch Autism Conference, I was one of the young adults on the panel, and I was 27 at the time. Back then, Sheila gave me a book which was by Dr. Willie Holiday. It's somewhere in my mini library here in my office/home office where I'm teleworking right now. And she recommended that I read it, and she gifted it to me. Even though I wanted to pick something up and read a book by Temple Grandin, as I had heard her speak a year and a half earlier when she was at the CDC. And so anyway, I should really check that book out. Thank you for the suggestion.
Great book.
So anyway, based on your research, is there also a common way that autistic women cope?
Well, I think part of what we talked about before, that masking is a way to cope. And then sometimes positive ways of coping is, positive relationship with whatever the interest is. Because sometimes, as Dr. Grandin has said, she took her interest and her special interest and her skills and stuck them all together and is quite successful in her career. So sometimes finding that thing that you're already passionate about with your skills and your interest, that could be kind of a positive way to cope. Unfortunately, some unhealthy ways to cope could be in kind of becoming an invisible person in online type groups and not really having interpersonal interaction. Sometimes food issues. A lot of women that I work with might have an eating disorder of some type that's kind of connected with autism or their interest. And with anxiety, sometimes how many people, whether you're on the spectrum or not, cope with anxiety or depression. I think that's kind of the same, whether you're autistic, neurodivergent, or neurotypical. There's a lot of unhealthy ways to deal with your anxiety or depression or loss of identity. So you can kind of channel it into a positive passion and, put it towards things. Or a lot of women, by the time they're coming into therapy or they're coming in to talk, it's because maybe they've chosen unhealthy ways and they're trying to figure out who they are, their identity, and then, how do I interact at work and not use my energy. Another great article out there called about conserving spoons, how to use some of your energy at work, save some for yourself later. So I think it kind of depends on the person, their family of origin issues, what kind of resources they've had throughout their life, what kind of support system they have. So people have really good support systems, and some people are more isolated and don't have a support system. So I think it kind of depends on the person, what their situation is.
So what kind of expectations are placed on females versus males who are on the spectrum?
I think one thing that certainly is unfair for our women, females on the spectrum, is because society has kind of gender coded women to be social ones. And, we do know that biologically in the brain, there are differences between the two brains of having some social skills, and maybe communication is higher in some women than over men. There's an unfair expectation then when a woman's on the spectrum versus her male counterpart, she should be better off socially. She should have social skills. So sometimes I see where my male clients, either as a child or teenager or young adult, they're on the spectrum, they get a pass for that social faux pas. They get a pass because they're a guy, in quote, they just didn't know better. But the females on the spectrum don't tend to get that kind of a pass. And then, unfortunately, neurotypical girls sometimes aren't very nice. And so they tend to more call out the mistakes, and they tend to kind of verbally bully and exclude. And I think that's that kind of unfair expectation for females on the spectrum versus males, is like, you should know better, you should have higher social skills because you're a female, and you should know not to say that to this group of girls. And it's just like, if you're not being included, it's your fault. You should know better, you've got to norm your behavior. And I think that's a very unfair expectation that are put on females on the spectrum.
Now, going back to my discussions about that synagogue I went to, now, the first rabbi that was there, he was great. He was very accepting of me and my disability. He was willing to just gradually pull me out of my shell. And while, yes, I'm a very, very outspoken person, there's a part of me that enjoys keeping to myself. And there's another part of me that really wants to connect with other people. And when I attended this synagogue, though, there was a new rabbi that took over because the other one stepped down because he wasn't making good choices. And this new rabbi had different expectations of me. And pretty soon the group started to change. People became really, really cliquish. And I had wanted to try to hold an education session where I did a PowerPoint presentation of what it's like to be autistic. And he didn't want to do that. He wanted me to work on my social skills, and he wanted me to socialize more. And he was constantly saying, now socialize, socialize, socialize. What's wrong with you? And there was another neurotypical woman at this congregation, and she was very mean to me. And she was sort of stuck on herself anyway. But I saw her bully me, and I saw her get jealous whenever anybody would sit with me. She would have, or one of her friends at least, she would have a fit, and she'd make comments like, you sat? Why didn't you sit with me? And then she also picked on me because I wasn't dancing. And she goes, you need to dance. I don't know what's wrong with you. And this is a grown woman, and I actually caught her mocking me one time. And I mean, she was awful. And then because I didn't live up to their expectations, I wanted to join the music team just so that I could be involved, because there were some people in the music team that I got along with, and singing is one of my passions. And the rabbi said that he wanted me to socialize more first. So in the meantime, he was going to allow me to help clean up after lunch, which he thought was a great area for me. And that was the end of the line for me. But that situation today still makes me very angry, and I'm very angry about what happened there, because they didn't know how to interact with me, and they didn't accept me for who I am.
And you're hitting on a very passionate point, because I personally believe the schoolhouse and house of worship should be leading the way for our communities on how to be inclusive. You should feel included in your house of worship. You should feel included in your school. Then those communities should really help educate the rest of the community on how to include and how to treat people who are different. Person first, not just person first language, but treat someone as a person first before anything else.
So one other thing, and then I'm gonna ask you a few other questions, but when I was at the synagogue, there was a woman that was a visitor there, and she knew there was something off about me. I didn't know why in the world she was laughing at me, but she was sitting in the congregant seats, and then I was sitting away from everybody else, just sort of eating snacks and just listening and kind of enjoying myself, enjoying the teachings. And she was just sitting there looking at me the whole time, and she's sitting there snickering at me. What do you think she was laughing about?
Sometimes when people who are different, they don't know what to do. They can be exclusive, can laugh, they can be fearful, they might be hiding something through nervous laughter, or it could be, form of that bullying or exclusion, because most people kind of have a little sense of the sensitivity of when someone's laughing, are they laughing with me or at me? And I think that's something common to all kinds of people is, what's this laughing about, right? So some people can even use laughing at someone as a way to kind of alter the power structure sometimes, because I can make you a little uneasy if you feel like I'm laughing at you. I'm kind of placing myself in a place of authority or superiority over you. So sometimes that laughing could be a way people use intentionally to kind of bully or demean, or it might be, I'm feeling socially awkward and I don't know how to interact with you either, and so I'm now laughing nervously. I think without being there, I didn't exactly know. In either way, the person probably didn't know how to interact. But I would say, when I encounter someone, it's like, well, I need to get to know the person first. I'd like to know more about this person and, their differences. In greater society, it seems like to be different, people fear different, or they want to push away those that are different instead of embracing and getting to know that person as an individual.
Well, and then you're also mentioning that women in society are not only expected to be social, but we're expected to have long hair and makeup and dresses, and we're supposed to have a figure. And I've had a lot of women, whisper behind my ears about how I look like a man, how I'm ugly, and I'm a very, very outspoken person. And I've told them like it is, and I've said, don't you have anything better to do than just criticize people who you don't know? And that works. So there's that. And then I had a toxic friend who I knew for about 8 years, and she was very, very jealous of me. She is also on the spectrum and had some problems of her own, but she's also somebody who's very, very good at manipulating other people. And then she has some other personality disorders of her own. But she was criticizing me. And she was always telling me that in order to get a boyfriend, I needed to dress like a girl and grow my hair out. And I needed to wear more makeup. And it wasn't just her that said that. It was her sister, too. They were telling me that I had to change. I mean, are toxic relationships common for women on the spectrum?
I think it goes back to that, that kind of vulnerability and, wanting a friend. There were many times as a parent when I would, try to point out to my daughter, someone's like, they're not really your friend. They're kind of controlling you, or they're using you because they want you on their team because you're going to do the best, science project. So sometimes they're ignoring or not noticing those kind of toxic predator people that maybe they're using you for something instead of really befriending you and wanting to be in a relationship with you. There's kind of something in it for them. And I do find that to be very common with all the people that I interviewed for my dissertation study. They had like pity invitations to parties, or say, ooh, look, I have a friend with someone with a disability. Or, their mom made them invite me because the whole class had to be invited. So there's kind of this, look at me, I'm a good person for having a friend with disability or who's autistic. That kind of stuff makes me sick on Facebook when some neurotypicals will pose with prom pictures, like, look how great I am because I'm being seen as someone with special needs. Some people kind of have that in their personality.
That's tokenism.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, this friend who said that stuff to me, she did use me out of loneliness, and she used me so that she could have her perfect wedding because she wanted to get married herself. And she was also very, very competitive, and she was always doing what she could to make me jealous of her because she was jealous of me. It's like anything that I ever wanted, she would always take that and rub that in my face. And I thought that she was my friend. And then there was a guy on the spectrum who I used to have a huge crush on, and he's all wrong for me. And that's another topic unto itself. But he never really liked me. He would only use me whenever he wanted something. And there was one time several years ago where I thought he was finally starting to come around and maybe he was giving me a chance, but really he just wanted me to help him with the project. And then after that, he just kind of treated me like a piece of trash and ignored me otherwise. And this is a male on the spectrum that did this to me. And I wanted a boyfriend so bad, and I was afraid that nobody else would want me. And so I just kind of put my eggs into one basket with this person when we really weren't compatible at all. So does that sound like that's common?
Yes, because it's back to like, every person, every human being wants to feel chosen, special, and that somebody picked them. That's just common human need. It's on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Belonging, purpose. And so when you think you found that, sometimes that might be where that rigid black and white thinking might be, well, I found this person. This is the person. And so they might be give those red flags, as we say in the field, that things not quite right. But sometimes a lot of my clients on the spectrum don't pay attention to those because they really want this to work. I want this to be my boyfriend or girlfriend. I want this to be my best friend. Almost like you're trying to will it into happening, even though that person is giving the signs that might not be the case. My daughter had a friend who referred to herself as the best friend, but as I really started paying attention, that person didn't really come over to our house very much, and I tended to see this person only reach out to my daughter when she couldn't reach out to anybody else. And it's like, we can be kind of secret friends, but at school don't hang out with me. I'm like, that's not cool. That's not really being a real reciprocal mutual friend. But my daughter was young, and she wanted so badly for the person to be her best friend because she hadn't really had a best friend at school. She was okay with this, quote, secret friendship until that, quote, best friend ended up being one of her biggest bullies. But missing some of those things caused just the need. I really want this person to be my friend. I really want to believe that this person is my friend, even though they're treating you differently than they treat the other friends, or kind of set boundaries and rules on you that they don't set on other friends. Or we could meet in contact here, but we can't meet in contact here. Then the project is over, or the schoolwork is over, or the Girl Scout or Boy Scout project is over, and I, quote, don't need you. And that's very hurtful. But then, they find another project, and now I want you back on my team again. And that feels like being picked again. It feels like having a purpose. And sometimes that's kind of part of that vulnerability sometimes in the population.
Yeah. And I remember when I lived with my roommates, I wanted to be accepted by them so bad. And sad to say, my roommates were heavy drinkers. And I got this idea that they only accepted people who, if they got drunk. So guess what? One of my roommates had a huge Mardi Gras party. And you know what you do for a Mardi Gras? Your whole theme is get drunk. So guess what I did?
You wanted to fit in.
So I got drunk. 21-year-old me got drunk, and I thought everybody would be happy, and then everybody was going to say, go girl. Didn't happen. I ended up making this roommate very angry, and several of her friends were embarrassed. And this roommate said some very nasty things. It was very passive aggressive. Instead of talking to me about it when she was calm, she left a note about how she was expecting me to clean the toilet. I refuse to clean a toilet, especially after somebody vomits in it. And then she also wrote in the note for me not to eat any of her leftovers because they were for people at work that didn't go to the party and couldn't make it to the party. And so I was very hurt when she did that to me. And I mean, there's just so many times where I have tried to fit in, and I've always seemed to be a magnet for the wrong types of friends. And I'll just kind of sit there and hope and wait for these friends. And I always end up getting upset because they're not treating me in the way that I want to be treated. And like you said, there's special conditions in place, or I'm not at the top of their list. So thank you so much for filling me in on that. This is a very, very educational talk. I mean, I learned a lot from you this time, just like you learned a lot from me. Right. And especially in question number 6, when you talked about tokenism and you're talking about making friends and dating, that has really, really helped me a lot. And I know for certain I'm not going to try to wait on this guy anymore. And even if he does try to ask me for something, again, he's on the spectrum, but he's not interested in me. He can't stand my personality because we're just very different. And then he has other problems of his own. And then he wants to be with someone who's the really, really geeky, smart girl, because Michael, or yeah, sorry, I just said his name, but because this person had because this person wants to be with somebody else who's more like him, and he wants to be with someone with a more docile personality, because he's one of those autistics that talks really slow. Like, you ask him a question and he'll say, he said, you can find this when, and then me, I talk really fast. And so it's like the tortoise and the hare. So, you know, a situation like that's not going to work.
Right. You've got somebody with, call it sometimes dial-up processing speed, and then supersonic SL processing speed.
Well, so he's like, I call it the tortoise and the hare approach. He's the tortoise and I'm the hare. So, but I have one more question and then I'm going to sign off now. But as you know, women on the spectrum have become a really popular movement. When did this start to kind of take grassroots?
Well, and kind of going back to when my daughter was being diagnosed, we had started that process like 2003, 2004. It was a 2.5-year process for her to get diagnosed. And I would, back in the day when you went to bookstores and you sat and looked at books, I was looking for anything on autism, Asperger's, anything on women, and it's nothing to be found except for even then an occasional book that might mention Dr. Grandin, but you know, she wasn't prolifically as writing and all of that kind of coming out back then either. You really had to search for a physical book. And I would say I started noticing more females kind of writing about their perspective somewhere around like 2009, 2010. So in the last decade, you know, we've had Jennifer O'Toole, and we've had Dr. Willie, and we've had Asperger girls and Aspie, and this movement to say, you know what, we're here too. This isn't a male syndrome, and there are many different ways that the autism can be expressed. So someone might be more maybe introverted, and Dr. Grandin would consider herself celibate, and she doesn't ever want to be, you know, in a romantic relationship. And you can have people seeking relationships who want to marry family, introvert, extrovert, sensory seeking, sensory aversive, want quote stereotypical typical careers, or you know, want to do something that quote autistic people shouldn't be doing. So I think as the writers started coming out, and there are especially Jessica Kingsley Publishing puts out a lot of books from the autistic perspective. I think as we started having more people on the spectrum writing and publishing, and not just the professional opinion, I think it's kind of when the movement started gaining some traction, because there was more information there, and more people were blogging, and women, daughters, mothers on the spectrum putting out their perspective. But I really feel like, from what I've seen, it's kind of anecdotal information more than research, but it feels to me about a decade ago was when the movement really started gaining traction, and we had, you know, more female speakers at autism conferences, and just more an abundance of research and writing out there.
So I remember when I first learned to accept myself as an autistic. That was the year I met this individual through an adult autism support group. And the person that ran the group was a person named Engineer Robert Morris. And he was a huge fan of Dr. Temple's. And he was always talking about gifts and talents. He was always talking about them, that we have potentials. And he was an autistic himself, and he went to Georgia Tech and got his education in mechanical engineering, and he was very successful, and he got married to a neurotypical woman. And you know, he did very well for himself when he was alive, and he became a father of 2 to 3 sons, I believe. And so that's what really inspired me, was joining that support group and listening to Engineer Bob. and I didn't always agree with everything he did, but that's kind of where I became more self-confident. But as far as me dating, I used to want that so bad, and there's a part of me that still would like to have a significant other, but I'd like to have more of a companion. But to be honest, I'm not super needy anymore, and I'm not desperate. I actually became worn out after dealing with this autistic male who kept jerking me around, and then also having to deal with this ex-friend who was really competitive with me and always rubbing things in my face and rubbing her significant other in my face because she was just that jealous of me. Those two situations have really caused me to lose interest. So I'm not in a big hurry to meet anybody. And I think it's because I'm busy doing my own things. I mean, I have a job at a university, and then I'm in school, and then I'm doing the podcast and doing the blogs and just living my life, that I'm not I'm hungry for that. I mean, I would rather learn how to drive a car versus meeting a significant other. And if it happens, it happens. So
that's right. And a lot of, it sounds like a very important piece was the self-acceptance, to accept yourself for who you are so that you'll accept nothing less than someone else who will accept you for who you are.
Now, there was a time where I was angry about having autism, and that was what I talked to you about during my interview with you back in September. I told you that I was in special ed, and that my mom tried to get me to listen to Dr. Grandin, but I wanted nothing to do with her because she had a doctorate degree, and I was in special ed being told I would never amount to anything. But I realize now that those teachers that say that stuff, they're taught the wrong things about us. And they are also taught all kinds of stereotypes and stigmas. And it also has to do with their own insecurities of their own. And I think they're scared that we're going to move up in our lives and that we're probably going to achieve more than they will. And I think that scares them. What do you think?
Right. I think, you know, when my daughter was in school just last year, and she was at that point in education major, they were in the exceptional or diverse learning class, and the textbook, which was printed in 2018, associate autism with mental impairment. And so the teacher, the professor, was talking about, you know, all people with autism, you know, are going to be in special education. My daughter raised her hand, like, I'm on the autism spectrum. I have exceptional IQ. I'm sitting in this class right now. I am not mentally impaired. And so the other people in class were kind of saying, well, then you can't have autism. If you're doing this in school, you can't have autism. People on autism spectrum are going to be this, this, or this, and they're never going to be able to do this, this, and this. So even in a class that was training future educators using a book that had been updated in 2018, there was still wrong information, and that information is disseminated wrongly to our future educators. So that's a whole nother passionate topic that came out of my dissertation, is the curriculum that is training our future teachers is often wrong and not teaching correct information about the population.
Well, last semester, I took a psychology of atypical child class, and I thought it would be all about autism, because I think atypical, I think of autism, but that actually goes into a range of disorders. And the woman that taught the class was absolutely wonderful. She just started working for the Marcus Autism Center. And in fact, I was just trying to reconnect with her about an internship over the summer. And I'm not sure that's going to happen now because of all the COVID-19, but I'm looking at a summer internship if things open back up so I can gain some experience in the field. But the girls, or the other women in the class, there are a bunch of them that just kind of gathered together. They found out I was autistic, and being the experiences they were trying to get, none of them were interested in approaching me. None of them were interested in getting to know me. I mean, just this little clique of women. And I found out later on down the line that I could hear them whispering about me, and they were uncomfortable with me in the room just based on their body language. And I kind of picked it up, and I talked to my counselor about this. But I caught a couple of them kind of gossiping about me, and luckily we had a group me going, and I called out a bunch of them on group me, and I said, hey, I understand that you guys are dogging at me behind my back. I said, I am paying the same money to be here. Leave me alone, knock it off. And one of the other girls in the group, who was outside of that clique, came up to me, and she was out of that group altogether. She came up and apologized to me, and she understood what was going on. And she said that she and her boyfriend were very upset about what was going on. And they kudos me for standing up for myself. And they said that they were proud of me for being in that class, and that they liked and agreed with everything I said. So it's an ongoing battle for me to try to connect with people. But I need to learn how to appreciate who I am and get to a point where I don't need to worry about fitting in. And perhaps that's just because I'm so young.
I think a lot of the stigma, Maya, is because Autism Spectrum is in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is a mental disorder book, a false stigma that someone on the spectrum, that this is a mental issue or mental disability, versus really the understanding of neurological wiring and neurodivergency and a difference. It is not a mental health or mental illness, and not that there should be stigma on mental health. But sometimes people, when they're talking about why they're uncomfortable, they somehow see someone with autism as a mental illness. And that's part of the stigma that has to be broken, not only on mental illness in general, but the association of it with autism spectrum.
Yeah, I'm about to get off here in a sec. And thank you so much for being on the show. And before I wrap up, I actually was ostracized by members of my family when I lived up in Minneapolis with those two roommates, because they thought that I had a mental disorder, and they thought that I was unpredictable. And that's another story unto itself. And they were scared that I would hurt my cousins. And that's because there was stigmas there. This was even though these family members are very highly educated people, and they went to some really good schools, but they had the nerve to stigmatize me and put me into the same category as someone with a mental illness, when they knew diddly squat about me. So, well, anyway, thank you so much.
Glad to be on your podcast today.
And anyway, you can find Stephanie Holmes on Converge Autism Radio. And hopefully some of you will see her at the conference in the fall. And I'm hoping to be there as a guest as well, being that I have been an interview on the podcast. And I would love to reach out to Kristen and just continue to network with some of these people. And also be sure to pick up Stephanie Holmes' books, and be sure to check out some of her resources. If you live here in Georgia and you're a woman on the spectrum, I will leave your link in my outside resources. And if you need to reach out to her through that, that's between you and Stephanie. But if you would like to have Stephanie on your show or on your conference for future engagements, I am more than happy to recommend Stephanie, because she's awesome and she's a great public speaker. I also recommend her daughter Sydney, because she's also a public speaker. And I had actually heard Sydney talk in a couple of video interviews back when she was about 15 years old. Right after I got hired at Georgia State, I went to the PBIS conference, or the GAPBS. What do you call it? GAPBS, I guess?
That's what I call it too, yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I walked into, I listened to 2 of your sessions, and you had done several interviews with Stephanie, and I was fascinated to hear her story, I mean, from the perspective of a 15-year-old versus that of a neurotypical that sits there and talks about the statistics of autism and bullying. So that was actually very nice. And I would highly recommend that you listen to Stephanie because she's really good, and then listen to Sydney because she's really good. So anyway, I wanted to also remind you that next week you will hear from Haley Moss. She's the first autistic lawyer in Florida to pass the bar exam, and she will be on our panel. And then also stay tuned for information about a surprise mystery guest. And I have a topic nailed down, but I don't know if I want to share it yet. Not without this person's feedback first, and not until I have everything nailed down. But for now, you just know that I have a topic and a surprise mystery guest, so please be sure to stay tuned. And then also, please know that I am calling for proposals. I'm accepting applications, and you can find that on the page. And you can also submit your CVs and submit your topics on there. So I'd be more than happy to collaborate with you on that. And then I have lots of other outside resources, and then I have my other resources. And you can tune in to other archived episodes of the podcast. And thank you so much. Until next time, this is Maya Sundermeyer, and I'm signing out tonight. Good night. Thank you much.
All right. Have a